listener production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with The Briefing. The federal government is telling Australians right now, do not travel to Lebanon. Any Australians in Lebanon are advised to return home. The warning comes in the wake of escalating conflict between Hezbollah and Israel at the southern end of Lebanon. It's one of 23 countries on Australia's Do Not Travel list, which also includes countries like North Korea, Russia and Bangladesh. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade says if you do travel to these countries, you're at high risk of death, imprisonment, kidnapping or serious injury. So what happens if you ignore the government's advice? And can the government legally stop you from going? Dr. David Bierman is Adjunct Fellow of Management and Tourism at the University of Technology, Sydney. He's also on the panel that advises the federal government on travel warnings. David, thanks for joining us on The Briefing. Can the government legally prevent me from travelling somewhere?
Well, they did during the period of COVID, especially during 2020 and 2021. They did exactly that. In fact, Australians were told they were not permitted to travel anywhere overseas for nearly 2 years. So the answer to that question, unfortunately, is yes.
And outside of a pandemic now, can the government say you can't travel here?
No, they can't. Basically, what happens is that the government's travel advisories are exactly that. They're advisories. So under the current circumstances, if somebody is told that they say can't travel to, or the government advises that you can't travel to Lebanon, just as an example, that doesn't actually force people not to go there. So people can still travel there, but of course, what advisories do is indicate the level of danger of a particular country. So because of the very likely possibility of war between Israel and Hezbollah in particular, the government's saying, we think it's a very good idea that you do not travel. And that has implications also in terms of what travel insurance companies are going to provide for support. So that with most travel insurance companies, not all, if you go to a country where the government travel advisory says do not go there, then there's a pretty good chance they won't cover you.
There is such a thing as a declared area offence, meaning that you could face up to 10 years in prison for going to a declared area. But that's not what's happening with Lebanon at the moment, is it?
No, it isn't. And in fact, it did actually happen during COVID, but although there were people who did travel because if they were going for government-approved meetings or government business or even a business that was regarded as central to the national interest of Australia, people were still allowed to travel. But if you weren't in that situation, yes, you could have been in legal trouble.
But presumably only if you ended up coming back to Australia to face it. That's right, isn't it?
Well, that's true, yes. If you were going one way to a place, the Australian government couldn't touch you.
So there are currently 23 nations on the government's Do Not Travel list. How does a place make it onto a list like that?
Generally speaking, the decision of the level of travel advisories, and there are 4 levels of travel advisory. So if you're in the Do Not Travel category, it is the government's opinion that a place is a security risk. Also, too, because it may be politically unstable, because it's in a war zone, because there is a very risk to life, limb and property for the traveller. And in fact, there are a whole lot of areas. But it's interesting, when governments are deciding about the level of a travel advisory, they get advice from a number of different quarters. I guess the main one is intelligence, military intelligence. Sometimes it could be ASIO. In many cases, it could be what we call friendly intelligence services. So that, for example, Australia is part of what we call the Five Eyes group of countries. That's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and the USA. So there's a lot of sharing of intelligence information between those 5 countries. And there are also other countries which are considered to be friendly areas of advice. That they might include Japanese intelligence. They could also include sometimes the Mossad in Israel, and various other sources that they could be using. So that's one. The other area, of course, is economic issues. So that, for example, if a country is seen to be an economic basket case, it'll often travellers are often advised not to go to those countries because they can't use banking services, exchange services are difficult. So there are a number of different categories for a country to make it deemed as undesirable for Australians to visit.
You've written that some of these advisories or the way that they're issued has changed since COVID. Can you describe that?
I think for a long time, governments tended to ignore the suggestions of people in the travel industry. So tour operators, which might operate regularly in a particular country, are actually a very good source of advice because, and I remember when we first started the concept of the Consular Consulting Group, not only the Australian government, but many other governments poo-pooed travel industry intelligence simply because they thought all we wanted to do was make money from tourists. Now, the thing is, as I and many other people let the Australian government know, dead travellers are very, very bad for business. So, the tourism industry, generally speaking, has a vested interest in places being deemed as safe for travellers. So the travel industry is added to that. There's a lot of advice that comes to government from insurance companies, and the Insurance Council of Australia is actually part of that group that advises DFAT about travel advisories, and they've worked very closely with them. Organisations like Choice, and certainly we've had a lot of travel agencies who have regular dealings with the country have been brought into the advisory network, which is very good. So that's been the biggest change that we've seen probably over about the last 21 years that I've been involved in being a part of the government's consular consultative group. This is, by the way, none of us get paid for doing this, but it is... It's important that the engagement between government and the travel industry, certainly since the Bali bombing of 2002, has been quite extraordinary. And actually, Australia, to its credit, was the first country in the world to actually bring the travel industry into the advisory network, which I think has been terrific.
What happens if you're in one of these countries that gets on the do not travel list?
Well, normally what will happen is, particularly if you're a traveller and you've registered with Smart Traveller, and a lot of people who are going to countries that might have questionable security situations will actually tend to do that, then the nearest Australian embassy or consulate or diplomatic legation will actually advise that traveller, things are a bit dicey in that country, we suggest that you get out. And in fact, actually, Australia, amongst many other countries too, has been pretty good about advising its citizens to leave. And what they'll also do is put an announcement in the local media that, Australians are being advised to depart a particular destination in extreme circumstances. And we actually had this happen in Lebanon in 2006 when the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel occurred. DFAT actually evacuated 14,000 Australian citizens, many of who had been living in Lebanon most of their life but had permanent residency or Australian citizenship. And we've also had cases, for example, when there's been a natural disaster, and this certainly occurred during the Indian Ocean tsunami and the Japan earthquake and tsunami and various other things, where the Australian government's actually chartered aircraft to take Australians out. In fact, in 2011, they did it in 3 places. They did it in Egypt during the Arab Spring uprising. They did it in Japan, and they did it in several other countries as well where there were sort of disasters occurring. So the Australian government really tries, and it's the duty of care of all governments. The Australian government's really taken very seriously the duty of care to try and evacuate people in an extreme circumstance.
And just lastly, if you're someone who's about to go overseas somewhere, other than just don't go to the places on that list, what would be your top advice for them?
My top advice is, if it's absolutely necessary for a person to go to a place which has been designated as do not travel, the first thing people should do is find out whether there's any insurance cover, because insurance is very important. 90% now of Australians who travel internationally take out travel insurance, which is pretty good. We'd like it to be 100%. So that's an important thing. I guess if you're going to a place which is a potential trouble spot, then obviously try and work out, your escape plans even before you leave. And of course, preferably if a place is designated as do not travel, take the government's advice and don't go there. Because you'll often find too, with do not travel, it doesn't necessarily apply to a whole country. I mean, I'll give you an example. With Israel, the government's travel advisory of Israel will tell you to avoid any place near the Lebanese border, obviously in and around the Gaza Strip. It doesn't tell you necessarily not to go to Israel at all. So many travel advisories are actually a lot more nuanced, and it was something that I certainly played a role in, and several other people did in telling the government, don't just blanket a whole country with do not travel. Be a little bit more nuanced on it, because there are some parts of the country which may be perfectly safe and some countries which are inherently dangerous.
So get yourself informed before you travel. That's great advice.
Yes, very much so. And, fortunately, most countries in the world have pretty good websites which will tell you about things. Be a little bit careful about some of the things that come from national tourism organisations. Classic case, when there were riots going on in Hong Kong in 2019 and 20, the Hong Kong Tourism Board said there are some processions going on. So when the Hong Kong airport was actually occupied by protesters in mid-2019, the Hong Kong Tourism Board, under a lot of pressure from the Chinese government, would say there's a procession going on there. They didn't say there was a riot. So some national tourism organisations are very honest about what's going on. In fact, I'd say the majority of them are, but there are a few, because of political pressures, to only give good news, don't always tell the whole story.
Thanks so much for your time, David. That's great advice to follow.
Thank you for having me on.
That was David Bierman there, Adjunct Fellow of Management and Tourism at the University of Technology, Sydney. Thanks for listening to The Briefing. That's it for this episode. A reminder, we put out full eps of our weekend briefing chats on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom to see them. You can also catch up with our other video content on TikTok at Listener Newsroom and on Instagram, which is at The Briefing Podcast. And if you like this ep, why not share it with someone you think might enjoy it too? I'm Benzion Siebert. Catch you next time.